The answer is yes, 100%. Go see Dune Part 2 in the theater with the caveat that you do need to watch Dune Part 1 again before you go because it picks up right where Part 1 leaves off. So, just for a little bit of background, I'm coming into this having only read a few pages of the first book of the Dune trilogy. I have not read the entire book, so my perception of this may be a little different than others who have read the books. So before we get into spoilers, I just want to say if you haven't seen Dune Part 2, but you were really iffy on Dune Part 1, go to the theater, see it in the theaters. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised. Just don't make the mistake of not seeing Part 1 again before you go to the theater. Now, let's get into the spoilers. Dune Part 2 has a story arc that is almost complete in and of itself, which is something that can't be said for Part 1. And for me, that makes the viewing experience completely different because with Part 1, I was struggling to connect with the characters. I was struggling with the fact that the plot points seemed to be few and far between. And while it is setting up the larger story, for me, going back and viewing that film, it just doesn't have enough meat on its bones to be considered a great film. For me, a great film is one that when I go back and rewatch it, I'm not only interested in what's happening in the scene because it's moving the plot forward and things are happening to the characters and the inherent interpersonal conflicts and the drama, but also it's something that is almost self-contained where each scene is interesting inherently just by the nature of what's going on in it. And so it's rewatchable. So when I look at something like Dune Part 1, I don't really feel that it's that rewatchable. Whereas Dune Part 2, you have the story arc, you have the revenge story, you have the characters connecting and having conflict, and by the end of it, you still feel a cathartic sense of relief because you have the completion of the revenge story. But on top of that, you're also setting up the houses, a greater war between the houses, right? So you have anticipation for the future, but you could end it there and still feel satisfied with the film on its own. Dune Part 2 has the advantage of being able to get into the action right away. So immediately we have Paul squaring off with Hamas in a duel, and for me that is just a great inciting incident to the film where we want to see what happens, we want to continue the story, we want to know what's going to happen next. Dune Part 2 really picks up for me when Paul starts calling out things from the past that he couldn't possibly know unless he is the Kwisatz Haderach. And for me, the acting comes together, the music comes together, and I think it's a really powerful moment. And from then on, I think the film is great. You know, looking at Part 1, right, all the pieces are there. You have great actors, you have great vistas, you have bombastic, droning music that's really elevates the images on the screen, and the sci-fi elements to me I felt were really clean, and I like the look of the film and the cinematography. And going even further into Dune Part 2, I just felt that the plot and the story really started to come together. Paul kills the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen and gets revenge for his father's death, but we take it one step further, and Feyd-Rautha is defeated while fighting in the place of the Emperor, and Paul also bests Feyd-Rautha. And so we get almost this double serving of catharsis with Paul taking control and getting revenge. And now we're setting up the ending where the houses are going to fight. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the relationship between Paul and Shani and how with the ending, with her taking off into the desert, that sets up some questions about how the future will play out. Now, of course, I have not read the books, so this is just from viewing Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2 of the series. I have not seen the old films either. So I will say, when I started watching Dune Part 1, I had not read any of the books, and while the story was simple, I still didn't quite understand what it was leading to or what the point of it was. And after reading just a few pages of the first book in the Dune series, I felt that I had such a better understanding of what is going on and what it's leading to. and what the terms mean that it just made watching Dune Part 1 so much better. So I recommend even reading just a little bit of the book before you watch Dune Part 1. And of course, I recommend watching Dune Part 1 before you go into Part 2. But again, it's not a movie that I would really care to revisit. I think Dune Part 2 is a movie that could be worth revisiting. And of course, in anticipation of what they do with the films next. I was a little bit hesitant about this being my first review since after watching part one, I just wasn't into it, and I didn't want to have my first review being something where I'm taking shots at a beloved franchise. And at the end of the day, this film really turned it around for me, and I'm excited to see what's coming next. So this channel isn't going to be just me talking about movies. I want to invite viewers to come and have a discussion with me so we can get both sides, multiple varying opinions. And so next week we're going to be discussing the movie Imaginary. Come and join me at 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Mountain, or 6 p.m. Pacific, and we'll discuss Imaginary. Of course, you have to see the film to discuss the film, so you'll have to watch it Thursday night and then join me at the link below, and we'll just have a discussion about the film. We want varying opinions. We want people who like the film. We want people who don't like the film, and we want people in the middle too, so we can get a full cross section of viewers and see what people think. So again, go see Dune Part 2. Even if you didn't like Part 1, make sure you watch Part 1 first and maybe read a little bit of the book before you go, but that's not a requirement. Be sure to join me next week for discussing Imaginary.